I want to start by reflecting on the question of what we are doing when we talk about what we're talking about in each of these cases, but also throughout the day. Because one of the trends I noticed, I was talking during the break, is wanting, sort of wanting answers to the questions that are being raised here, and thinking about what it means to look to an artist for answers, or to look to an exhibition or curatorial research, and to find only more questions. And I would like to sort of begin with this question and to think about how you formulate both the motivation and the outcome, and how you think about the reception and the impact of the work that you're doing. And each of you in different ways, I think, is engaged in something that's quite moving and feels very time sensitive, which I think can tempt us as viewers to want to sort of instrumentalize this information and fix it, for lack of a better term. And that discomfort of not knowing where to begin, I think, is one of the great things that artistic and curatorial practice can give rise to, is that this impossibility in a way of fixing it. I would like to, I'd like to actually to start with Abdul, and to think about how you think about your practice in this regard.
Yeah, that's a very difficult question to answer, I suppose, because I just usually respond to questions that I have, and usually very subconscious questions that I haven't really been able to articulate yet, Things that I feel sort of like strike me with a sense of dissonance. That dissonance is what provokes me to kind of investigate, and my investigation is just a process of recording and simulating, and then sort of like letting that sit until something emerges out of it. And I try not to really think about how it's seen, because I don't really believe that there's something I can control. I think if you respond to a certain culture in a certain way, I guess I'll use a word that's taken from social media. There's a sense of virality to what you produce that kind of connects with people out there in a sense. And you can't really kind of quantify why or how that happens. It just happens because of it being produced in a particular context, I guess.
Can you give me some examples of receptions that you've experienced to your work?
I guess one example that I can just think about right now is because a friend of mine sent me a video. I made this sticker. We all know the Shepherd Fairy sticker, where you have, onto the giant and obey. So I just took out onto the giant's face, and I replaced it with the face of a lion, which is the symbol of the ethnic majority in Sri Lanka. But it was the lion that was on this very popular beer can in Sri Lanka. So it was supposed to be this kind of ironic detournement, which is supposed to critique the idea of nationalism in Sri Lanka. But you'd only sort of like see that if you're aware of Shepherd Fairy's work and you understood the irony in what he's trying to do. So this sticker actually became quite popular with people who are very pro kind of like ethnic nationalism in Sri Lanka as well. So a friend of mine sent me a video today of a tuk-tuk driver sort of talking about this as some sort of like possible cult that he doesn't know about that's violently extremist in a sense. So it's actually a bit of you could say that it's a bit of a mistake that I did, but sometimes you just put things out there and you just don't really know how they kind of play out, because you play with symbols and stuff like that.
Well, especially when you're pulling on multiple sort of strains of language and cultural reference, it's like quite the high wire act. Yeah. Ali, I'm thinking also about what you're doing as a kind of witnessing as well, which is helping us to remember what we never knew, in a way. And do you, when you're, especially in the exhibition where you're looking at the fishing traps and you talked about degrowth, do you view your practice in terms of a call for action? Or how do you think about your audiences and what you're doing, and the discomfort or the comfort or the reassurance that, part of it could be very reassuring to know that without technology, the Gulf still managed to find food and build structures and get water and so on, without industrial technology.
It's a good question because, I mean, on one hand, I think as an architect, you're always confronted by urgency. I mean, I think it's one of the big legacies of the modern movement, the idea that you need to respond to a housing, simultaneously, they're like pointing out crises and the need to address them, but also the fact that it is an artificial process of this kind of creation of urgency which draws clients to you, saying, oh, there's a housing crisis, there's a architectural crisis, there's this need to convert oil rents into a quality of life. And so on one hand, you're constantly kind of aware of the crisis, but then on the other hand, you're also in like the world's only slow profession. And like, as things get increasingly, it's why I find also architects, this is just me, I'm also kind of concerned, but like architects that are interested in like apps so funny, because you pick the one industry that, like, by the time you finish a building, you've got like 5 new iPhones. Like, it's just such a slow profession, and it takes so long that also I think it's impossible to have that sense of urgency. And so, I mean, not that there aren't real issues that need to be addressed, but that you're in the position, both intellectually in the sense of your training and also in your ability to think of time spans, where you understand that the work you do, yes, addresses a particular moment, but also will take 3 years to produce or 5 years to produce, and that eventually the things you do will be seen much, much later. And I think for that, I mean, especially today is actually quite interesting because you've seen 2 Kuwait pavilions and 1 UAE pavilion. And so you're able to understand that like really these things only enter discourse somehow 3-4 years later, 5 years later almost. And so I think we're both aware of the sense of urgency, but also the idea that the things you do have to have like a 5 or 6 years span before they have any relevance. And so to go back to the question of what we do in the context of, let's say, the sense of reassurance, I think on one hand there is the need to kind of imagine these things and preserve a sense of the past. And so there is the need to go through the exercise of saying, well, these fish traps existed and they constituted a form of land ownership that is more or less incompatible with the modern state and the modern understanding of the coastline. But they're also, so in terms of that, there's the need to maintain that past, but it's also a critique of the present. It's a critique of forms of ownership which are so slow and also don't allow for actually what is much more ambitious, like the idea that you can own something on a year-long lease that doesn't, like the fish traps don't constitute a form of ownership of land. They're a right to use. As long as you maintain it, you're allowed to use it. So in some sense, they're actually much more radical forms of ownership. And so for us, it is, yes, there's this element of the past, but really it's this looking for forms of ownership, ways of thinking that reconfigure present day. And I think there should be a sense of satisfaction knowing, okay, the Gulf makes sense in absence of oil and technocratic solutions, but also it's actually saying, look, we need to be able to reformulate our understanding of land, of territory, and also the legal apparatuses which allow for movement and for creativity. And that's what that one's meant to do.
I really love that moment where you pointed out that this has been illegal for so long that nobody thinks to challenge it anymore, where there's kind of some kind of sovereignty happening that can't be easily explained, and yet there it is. And
I mean, I think in the Gulf, neglect is the only form of generosity left. Like, the only public spaces, the only collective infrastructure is things that have been neglected, sometimes out of kindness and sometimes just purely out of neglect.
not only in the Gulf, let's be honest, yeah. Okay, so, Tassif, I'm thinking about, it was your talk actually that raised the questions for me, like pointed me to think about the questions for the other talks, which is, you drew this really interesting line between water infrastructure and financial liquidity. Yeah. And so the word liquid is really beautifully, shall we say, flowing through your talk. And I wonder if you could talk about how you think about these artists' practice from the perspective of witnessing interventions and participating in these larger liquidities and infrastructures. And then also the question for me that sometimes comes up is socially engaged work versus activism, and this is where I get a little sophomoric, so take it away.
Yeah, I sort of anticipated that question because I think, look, I mean, I don't think that there is anything inherently bad about socially engaged practice, but I am a bit of a skeptic toward what its aims are. I mean, or its ambitions and its ideals and its realities are so often drastically different that I wonder about kind of what function it has now. It was interesting as you were talking, Ali, about these projects. I was thinking about the second part of the title of my presentation, like futures and futurity, and I think the financialization of the future as a financial instrument. So you have stocks and bonds, and if architecture is something that pays off later, that is also analogous to how a lot of financial instruments work. And I mean, in a very literal way, one way that there's an entire market of is like speculative architecture, right? So like investing in these structures that will eventually be built. And I think, to go back to the socially engaged practice question, what I think is a bit of a problem with that is that it assumes that those payoffs are both like readily measurable and will be measurable in like a very short amount of time, such that like these socially engaged practices like often are not very long term. They're not very sustainable in any way, even though like perhaps like in a grant proposal they might be framed in that way. And I guess what I am interested in within these artist practices is if there is this sense of urgency, if there is this, recognizing that the Yamuna is like polluted, or recognizing that these ways of living are just not tenable, the artist intervention is perhaps one immediate way that people, artists, feel that they can intervene, but I don't think that necessarily all those interventions are anticipating immediate payouts the same way that like a strictly socially engaged practice is. And in that sense, I think that analogy of the water flowing and the kind of the flow finances, which is totally like a Hito analogy, I do think that offers perhaps maybe like a positive way of thinking about how to approach these issues. If so much of our futures are contingent on these instruments of financialization, if our future is, if we're nostalgic for a future that's lost, to use Rohan's terms, like I think it's because so much of it has been eaten up by these speculative practices and these promises of payoff, but to engage as some of these artists do in the present, without this sort of anticipatory framework of that's going to pay off like immediately, but rather it's more of a way of dealing with the now. That's how I'd like to think about them. Yeah.
A means to respond and engage, not necessarily. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I want to open it up to the floor. Let's one and then two. Yeah. Just wait a second for the microphone. For Sonia.
Hi. It's a twin question. Thanks a lot, Maya, for the question that you asked, because that also answers some of the questions which I had in my mind. Thanks a lot to all of you for bringing so much information today and your perspectives. My question is actually to do with the photograph and the image, and I do not mean to suggest that they are mutually exchangeable, so that in itself is a question too. But while for these three presentations, I'm going to club together Halik's and Ali's, where social, ecological, political issues are talked about through, are posited and then spoken about through images. And in a way that the image is taken at face value and without critique, really. And that makes me think of the role of the image and the photograph? Has that now come to replace the role of the native informant in a way? That's one kind of question. The second is for Tofis.
Tafsir.
Okay, sorry. Again, it's a whole set of very urgent ecological, social, and political issues and questions. And then you bring a series of images of works of artists, which are, those images are very loaded because they are artworks. And that begs, for me, I'm still thinking, the question of how do we resolve or reconcile the photograph or the image as affect at the same time when it has to simultaneously, do the role of being a critique and a representation as well. And a little aside, only because I'm an artist and authorship is important, the image that you showed from Khoj hosted that event, but the author of that work, the staging of the Narmada thing, is Zulekha. She wasn't mentioned, so yeah.
Anyone want to pick it up?
Shall I have a go? Well, I think that's a super interesting question because I feel, I guess this relates to the earlier question also about artistic interventions and why they open up questions. And personally, I feel it's because we're living in this state of uncertainty. There are no certainties anymore. So any sort of intervention or any sort of effort of providing a solution is not going to sort of actualize because there are no solutions, there are no truths anymore. Everything is a subjective kind of like view on things, no? And I feel like images are so present today, not just on our devices, but simply in terms of how we sort of view things or how we project certain things. Like development in Colombo is entirely dependent on this image and a belief in a certain kind of image. Like the Lotus Tower exemplifies that because it's just this monument that for all sort of intents and purposes should go against all developmental issues or developmental sort of like best practices in terms of maintaining economic autonomy, in terms of maintaining good financial sense, but then you create, through all that sort of like malpractice, you create this beautiful image and somehow it speaks for itself, And the only way you can sometimes sort of like combat image is with another image, and I feel like we are so conditioned to producing images simply as a way of kind of like participating in this culture of like speaking through images that is so sort of like prevalent today in a sense. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. Opens up a lot of like things to think about. Yeah.
Okay. Should we move? There was a next, yeah?
Actually, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe I think it's interesting that you make the distinction. I don't have a good answer for this one, but I think the distinction between the image and the photograph is an interesting one. I think increasingly, kind of to touch upon the stuff brought up in the previous presentation, you go about finding the image the image precedes the photograph, and by the time the photograph is taken, it has already been constructed. And so really, so much of it ends up being this looking for the photograph rather than but not as a search for the photograph, but recreating it in person. And it seems, I think the water tower one is a great example because it's in this maybe desire to reconstruct the Beckers, you understand that their role as landmarks rather their role as these typological entities is what's revealed, and the role that they play in this aspect. And so to go back to the image and the photograph, I think on one hand we're constantly subject to the fact that we know the photograph we want to take, we just go to take it. But somehow the process of doing that informs you mainly, maybe more so in the writing than the photograph itself. Increasingly because you could just, if you don't find that photo, you draw it, or you produce a diagram. But just I think the process of constructing it in your head and searching for it is perhaps much more instructive, whereas the photograph is just kind of a proof of having found it.
Okay.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on something that Tausif said at the very beginning of his presentation, which I thought was very important when you talked about how these practices offer a different language to talk about natural disasters, environmental change, urbanization, and all of these issues that exist in parallel as things that are discussed in a different language, and that language could be damaging. And I wanted to offer a slight provocation there to sort of think that to what extent those practices and the language of those practices and the language that you use to present them, the language that we are using here, exists actually quite outside of the language that is the one used by those who live those spaces and those who build those spaces. Because in a way, and how do we find a way to connect those, which could be also a way of asking a similar question to what Maya was saying, is how do we translate this into action? But I wanted to focus on the language point, which I thought was very important.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important question, something that I wrestle with a lot, because I think about this both with regard to, you know, as I was reading all this kind of like sociological and like you know, World Bank data about urbanization and that particular language versus the language of you know, artists. I guess what I'm interested in a broad way, and this is another, as I do this, you know, in this speech act, it's another form of abstraction. But I'm wondering how certain kinds of abstraction, so like an artistic abstraction, an obfuscatory, like, you know, government language, like that kind of abstraction. Abstractions are ways to deal with the kind of impossibility of negotiating with reality, right? So, like, I mean, if the lived reality of someone suffering under, you know, climactic, you know, change is that they're drowning and things like that, and like that's obviously you need real non-abstract ways to deal with that. How does one not experiencing that, you know, me sitting in my like office in Philadelphia, how do I kind of like even negotiate that kind of reality? And I think there is a certain degree of distance that is required to have a real understanding of external problems. I mean, in a very Wittgensteinian sort of sense, like there's this Joseph Koseth work that says, you know, what you think is a gift is really a problem for you to solve. And when you try to solve problems that seem too difficult, you have to find a way of relating them or reframing them in ways that break it down or let you see it in a different way. And I think that part of the abstraction that happens with the kind of financialization of our neoliberal present, with, you know, stocks and bonds and like all these kinds of forms of aid, all these forms of loans, and all these kinds of ways of really abstracting real problems, the only way that I can sort of see that being countered is through another kind of abstraction. This also kind of ties to what you were talking about in terms of like photographs. I mean, the images that I showed, the photographs aren't the work; they're documentation of the work. The work is, you know, the actual like participatory or installation or something like that. Like what we're looking at is like one thing removed from it, and perhaps the nature of these kinds of practices are an insistence upon the actual reality rather than like the abstract image that we see later. I've been thinking about, you know, installation shots the entire time at this conference, both from Randhir's presentation and all these other kinds of ways of thinking about what does that sort of distance and abstraction do. In certain senses, I do think it helps us reframe real life problems. In other ways, perhaps it moves us further away from them. And that balance, that sort of negotiation is like impossible to determine beforehand.
I think we have time for one more question.
Of an installation, and then there's a narrative which probably describes the image or the photograph. However, asking the question was also a way of bringing it to what happens in the discursive space, because we do call it not image in the formulation of this, this conference. It is exchanges between photograph, art, and architecture. So, you know, how, then what gets privileged, or what sort of takes a little bit of a backseat in a discursive space? Is it always the narrative of a situation, or are we also able to somehow bring back the the importance of the image or the photograph. Yeah. It's not a question, I'm just bringing this.
All right. So who's next? And I think as it's the end of the day, if there are bigger questions in general as well that have come up over the course of this day, I think this is a moment for discussion as well about the overall impressions or ways of framing the question of temporariness of space. Yes.
I just think one of the undercurrents for me in all of the presentations today has been, and I guess maybe we've been skirting around it or maybe we're past it, I don't know, but is reconsidering public and private, not just in terms of space, but also in terms of what the state provides and what the privatization of those spaces means across the Gulf and South Asia, right? And living here, it's interesting because actually things that look like they should be private are actually owned by the state. Whereas, I was just in Beirut for the Ashkal and Walden homeworks, where people were reclaiming downtown Beirut, the fact that Martyrs Square is where the protests are happening. There were discussions with the people I was with around how, that the privatization of that space was one of the problems of central Beirut. And then it was interesting because I met somebody in Beirut who used to work for Solidaire, now works for the World Bank, and has been traveling to Karachi because there's a World Bank project to gentrify downtown Karachi. And I had this late night conversation with her saying, please don't turn it into another downtown Beirut, like it's the last thing we need. But yet, I went for the biennial. Like most biennials, it is part of this cultural project supported by the city government and by the cultural elite to say we want to reclaim these spaces, but actually it is part of a kind of wider vision of this, super accessible, pretty city. Very, similar to what Halik has been talking about in Colombo. And I just wanted to kind of reflect on that collectively.
I'd like to go back to Michelle on this, because I think that a lot of Michelle Bambling's work deals with the public and private, and the public being the public building and histories being witnessed through private family photographs, and that this was a way of mapping an architecture's history, but also kind of complicating the narrative of the history of the Gulf. And I was curious, sort of, from the beginning of your performance, to put you on the spot now that it's the end of the day, from the beginning of your presentation to now, if these questions have been coming up for you as well, because the public and private was one of the most charged elements of your project, at least in the initial stages, I think.
This is a pretty simplistic response, but when I looked at the private, for the most part, it was a discrepancy between the Emirati people that I interviewed, and they felt they had ownership in their houses and that was theirs as Emiratis. And then I talked to people who rented their offices, who were expats or transnationals who were renting their apartments, and they didn't speak of it as their permanent place, but a place that was temporary, and would be renewed or would change and move. And so I felt like there were two different attitudes towards the private in that sense.
That's a really interesting point about the experience of your home as a private place that is not ultimately yours, whether you're renting or not. Yeah. Okay. Other thoughts?
I'll add just one thought. It's mostly, I thought of it during the second panel, but many of these talks have been looking at ephemerality and tracing the temporal. And in the second talk, when it was mostly makers responding to that, I thought they were doing what you just said. They were grappling with a problem and breaking it down. But by looking at the invisible, they actually made it visible. And so that was really interesting to me, that they engaged in that process that way. And even in terms of the curators and the scholarship, people are bringing to the surface something that they feel, I believe, is not visible at all. And so I was thinking, why? And you were answering those questions, many of you, to document, to raise awareness, perhaps a form of activism. So it's not a direct answering of those questions, but they are provocative, and there is some sort of, through the visibility of this, there is something very important happening here in my mind.
Right, and the wonderful thing about that is that there is the inability to answer the to what is actually that moment right before you answer the to what, is being suspended in that moment throughout this day has been a really wonderful place to be in. I really want to thank the organizers for this. Thank you all. Okay.